The winter of the year 1135 settled over the kingdoms of England and Normandy with a heavy gray stillness. In the forested lands of Lyon-la-Forêt, far from the bustling courts and markets, the king who had ruled England for more than 3 decades came to the end of his days. Henry I, son of the Conqueror, known to chroniclers as the Lion of Justice, breathed his last and left behind a realm that had long depended on his firm and steady hand. For 35 years, he had imposed order on both sides of the Channel, balancing the rivalries of powerful barons, enforcing the authority of royal law, and guiding his dynasty with an unyielding sense of purpose. Yet death came as it comes to all, and with it came uncertainty. News traveled quickly, carried on cold winds, and whispered across halls lit by flickering torches. In castles and cloisters, men spoke in lowered voices, asking who would take the crown. The death of a king was never merely a personal tragedy. It was the unsealing of a question that touched every lord, every bishop, and even the humblest peasants who would soon feel the tremors of disorder. Henry had not always faced this prospect of doubt. In his earlier years, he had secured the succession through his son, William Etheling, a boy groomed from childhood to inherit both England and Normandy. But fate had dealt Henry a cruel blow. In 1120, the White Ship had gone down in the cold waters of the Channel, carrying with it the young prince, and with him the hope of direct male succession. Chroniclers described the calamity as the greatest disaster of the age, for it left the royal line exposed and fragile. From that night on, Henry knew that the destiny of his house depended on his one remaining legitimate child, his daughter Matilda. Matilda was no ordinary woman. From her youth, she had been sent across the Alps to wed the Holy Roman Emperor, and for more than a decade she had borne the title of Empress, moving among the courts and councils of Europe with the dignity of imperial rank. She had witnessed the grandeur and the intrigues of empire, and when she returned to her father's realm as a widow, she carried herself with a pride born of that experience. To Henry, she was the rightful heir, the vessel through which the Norman dynasty would endure. He required his barons to swear solemn oaths of loyalty to her, not once but several times, binding them by faith and by honor to support her claim. In a world governed by the sanctity of oaths, it seemed a safeguard strong enough to hold. Yet beneath the surface, doubts festered. The 12th century was not an age inclined to welcome a woman as sovereign in her own right. Kings were expected to ride at the head of armies, to command vassals with both sword and voice, and to embody the martial strength of feudal rule. Many of the Anglo-Norman barons, hardened warriors who had carved out estates in England since the days of the conquest, looked upon the prospect of a queen regnant with suspicion. They asked themselves whether her husband would rule in her stead, whether rival claimants might exploit her gender to weaken the crown, and whether God himself had intended for a woman to sit upon the throne of England. Henry, relentless as ever, pressed forward, but even his authority could not erase these questions from the minds of the realm's most powerful men. In an effort to secure her position, Henry had remarried in hope of fathering another son, but the union brought no new heirs. He sought instead to strengthen Matilda through alliance, wedding her to Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, a capable but young noble whose house bordered Normandy. The match was politically shrewd, binding 2 great powers, but it did little to ease the doubts of the Anglo-Norman barons, who often looked upon the men of Anjou as rivals rather than partners. Still, Henry pressed the matter, determined that the blood of the conqueror should continue through Matilda's line. When Henry died in December of 1135, the careful structure he had built began to crack. Matilda was in Normandy with her husband and could not rush to England to press her claim. Time was everything in such matters, and hesitation could prove fatal. Into that moment of hesitation stepped another figure, a man who had long been close to Henry's court, and whose ambition had waited for just such an hour. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew through his mother Adela, daughter of William the Conqueror, was quick to act. He was well-liked, affable in manner, generous in spirit, and skilled in winning friends among both clergy and nobility. Where Matilda appeared proud and distant, Stephen appeared approachable and chivalrous, the very image of the feudal lord who could inspire men to follow him into battle. As soon as word reached him of Henry's death, Stephen crossed the Channel with remarkable speed, braving winter seas to reach the shores of England. He rode hard for London, the heart of the kingdom, where his allies among the bishops and magnates were ready to receive him. In a matter of weeks, he secured the city's support and pressed his claim before the church. The archbishop and leading clerics, persuaded by arguments of stability and encouraged by Stephen's charm, crowned him king at Westminster. It was presented as a seamless continuation of Norman kingship, a necessary step to preserve order, but in truth it was a bold act of usurpation, for it disregarded the sworn oaths made to Matilda. Yet oaths, as history would prove time and again, could bend in the winds of opportunity. Thus, two figures stood in the shadows of Henry's death. On one side was Matilda, the rightful heir by birth and by oath, carrying the authority of imperial dignity and the blood of the conqueror. On the other side was Stephen, the opportunist nephew, swift of action, beloved by many, and already enthroned before Matilda could even set foot in England. Their rivalry was more than personal. It symbolized the larger struggle of the age, the tension between legality and convenience, between principle and pragmatism, between the old order Henry had tried to impose and the chaotic forces unleashed by his passing. For the common people, these high intrigues seemed distant, yet the choices made by lords and bishops would soon echo in their daily lives. A kingdom divided at the top meant uncertainty in the shires, violence along the roads, and burdens of taxation and war that fell most heavily on those least able to bear them. The chronicles written in monasteries would later lament that after Henry's death, there arose a time when Christ and his saints seemed to sleep, a time of castles built without royal sanction, of armies raised without consent, and of lords who preyed upon the weak in the absence of strong kingship. But for now, in the first months after Henry's passing, the stage was being set. The oaths of loyalty given to Matilda still lingered in memory, and many lords weighed their choices carefully. Some remained faithful to their promises, believing that the daughter of their old king was still their lawful ruler. Others turned to Stephen, convinced that his presence on the throne offered the best chance of peace and stability. The church itself, guardian of legitimacy, was divided, some bishops recalling their sworn pledges, while others placed their hopes in Stephen's conciliatory manner. England, a land that had enjoyed 3 decades of relative unity under Henry, now found itself on the edge of division. In Normandy, Matilda and her husband Geoffrey gathered their strength. They would not abandon her claim, for to do so was to surrender the legacy of her father and the destiny of their children. Proud, determined, and certain of her right, Matilda prepared to contest the throne. Across the Channel, Stephen settled into his new role, distributing favors, rewarding supporters, and presenting himself as the true king. Yet beneath the ceremonies of coronation and the outward show of authority, both he and his followers knew that the contest was not over. The oaths sworn to Matilda had not been forgotten, and the blood of the conqueror still flowed in her veins. Thus, with the death of Henry I, a kingdom that had been held together by one man's strength began to fracture. The tragedy of succession lay not only in the loss of a son on the White Ship years before, but in the unwillingness of the realm to accept a daughter as heir. In that refusal, in that breach between law and desire, the seeds of civil war were sown. What followed would be nearly 2 decades of strife, remembered by later generations as the Anarchy, a time when kinship turned to rivalry, oaths turned to weapons, and England itself became the prize in a struggle between 2 determined claimants. The story of Matilda and Stephen was only beginning, but already the lines had been drawn, and the kingdom of England braced itself for the storm to come. And so, with Henry I laid to rest, and the oaths to Matilda hanging uneasily in the minds of lords and bishops, the realm stood at a crossroads. The king was gone, the heir was absent, and the kingdom's destiny balanced on hesitation and speed. It was in this moment of uncertainty, when loyalty faltered and opportunity beckoned, that Stephen of Blois moved. Stephen wasted no time. The moment word of Henry's death reached him, he moved with a swiftness that revealed both preparation and ambition. Winter seas were treacherous, yet he braved the Channel, his ships cutting across the gray waters with urgency. Behind him lay Normandy, where Matilda and her husband Geoffrey lingered, unaware that their claim was already slipping from their grasp. Ahead lay England, anxious and waiting, where a crown unguarded beckoned him like a prize. In London, the city that had so often been the heartbeat of English kingship, the stage was set for Stephen's bold gamble. The barons there, unsettled by the idea of a female ruler, found reassurance in the familiar figure of William the Conqueror's grandson. Merchants and aldermen, who feared instability more than anything, welcomed the prospect of a king who promised order. Most decisive of all was the church. Bishops, who had sworn oaths to Matilda under Henry's command, now weighed their duty against the danger of disorder. Oaths, after all, were binding, but stability was sacred. In Stephen they saw not the strict fulfillment of promises, but the preservation of peace, and many chose to interpret duty through the lens of necessity. Matilda's absence gave Stephen the opening he needed. While she remained across the Channel, tied to her husband's campaigns in Anjou and the slow machinery of preparation, Stephen was already riding through the gates of London. The bells of Westminster tolled, summoning nobles, clergy, and citizens to witness a coronation hastily arranged but powerfully symbolic. The crown, Henry's crown, had scarcely been laid to rest before it was lifted again, this time over the brow of his nephew. The scene, remembered in chronicles and retold across generations, was rich with both ceremony and tension. Stephen knelt before the altar, the scent of incense filling the air, his head bowed in apparent humility. The bishop raised the crown, speaking words of sanctity, declaring that England would not be left rudderless. And as the circlet of gold was lowered onto Stephen's head, a murmur spread through the gathered lords. Some whispered approval, others exchanged uneasy glances, but all understood the enormity of what was taking place. An oath had been broken, and yet a king had been made. To the watching crowd, Stephen's face told its own story. Outwardly, he embodied confidence, a prince transformed into monarch by the rites of Holy Church. Yet in the flicker of torchlight, his eyes betrayed something more, an awareness that legitimacy was fragile, that the oaths given to Matilda still lingered in the hearts of many, and that his new crown rested as much on fragile alliances as on divine blessing. He was king, but a king who knew that others would contest the title. Why did so many rally to him? The reasons lay deep in the fabric of feudal England. First was the reluctance of the barons to accept a woman as ruler. For them, obedience was forged in bonds of war and loyalty on campaign, and few could imagine taking commands from a queen regnant. Second was the influence of the church. The Archbishop of Canterbury had hesitated, but other bishops acted quickly, arguing that the kingdom needed immediate leadership to avert chaos. They remembered the turmoil of disputed successions past and sought to avoid the specter of disorder. Third was Stephen's own charm. Known for his generosity, for his willingness to listen, for the knightly bearing that drew admiration, he appeared to many as the ideal balance to Henry's stern rule. And yet, beneath this surface of approval, dissent simmered. Those who had sworn to Matilda did not forget their vows. Robert of Gloucester, her half-brother, remained a formidable presence, biding his time. Other nobles tied to her through blood or loyalty to Henry's memory watched events unfold with unease. They would not move immediately, but in their silence lay the seeds of a future storm. For now, Stephen basked in his triumph. He was hailed as king, anointed with holy oil, and acclaimed by those gathered in the great church. London citizens rejoiced, seeing in him a promise of continuity. The bishops blessed him, invoking God's grace upon his reign. And yet the coronation, swift and improvised, lacked the secure weight of uncontested legitimacy. It was an act of boldness, but also of betrayal, a violation of the careful arrangements Henry had made, and a challenge to the very notion of sworn fealty that bound the feudal order together. As the crown settled on his head, Stephen surely knew that this was only the beginning. Matilda still lived, and her claim remained strong. The barons who stood silent today might raise their banners tomorrow. The church that blessed him might waver under pressure. His kingship had been seized, not inherited, and that difference would shape every moment of his reign. Thus the realm stood on the edge of a great divide. On one side was Stephen, the man of opportunity, who had acted while others hesitated and claimed the throne with speed and daring. On the other was Matilda, the rightful heir, whose absence had cost her dearly, but whose determination would not falter. Between them lay a kingdom, uncertain and uneasy, bound now for a struggle that would not easily be contained. The coronation at Westminster was not the end of a story, but the prologue to a long conflict. What seemed in that moment to be a triumph of ambition would soon reveal itself as the opening act of betrayal and war. The crown upon Stephen's head shone brightly in the light of candles, but in the shadows of the great church lingered the specter of resistance, whispering of battles yet to come. Stephen's coronation, swift and glittering in its ceremony, seemed in that moment to settle the question of succession. Yet beneath the chants of the clergy and the cheers of London citizens, a deeper unease lingered. The oaths sworn to Matilda had not vanished, nor had the memory of Henry's will. What appeared to be a triumph was in truth only the opening move of a greater struggle, for the act of crowning Stephen did not erase the question of legitimacy, it sharpened it. The struggle that unfolded in the wake of Stephen's coronation was not merely a contest of swords or a dispute between rival cousins. It was, at its heart, a crisis of legitimacy, a rupture in the very fabric of feudal order. England had known disputed claims before, but never had the stakes been set in quite this way. A daughter who had been sworn to as heir, denied her place by the swiftness of another's ambition, and a nephew whose crown rested upon oaths broken and promises undone. It was not only a question of who would wear the crown, but of what the crown itself meant. Legitimacy in the 12th century was never a simple matter of blood. It was a delicate balance of lineage, consent, and recognition. A king might trace his right through birth, but without the assent of barons and bishops, his claim could falter. Conversely, a usurper might seize the throne by force or cunning. Yet if enough voices acclaimed him as sovereign, the fiction of right could be transformed into a reality of power. In Stephen's case, the machinery of coronation and the support of the church gave him the outward trappings of authority, but those trappings were built on a foundation riddled with cracks. Every noble who remembered his oath to Matilda represented a fracture line, and every moment of weakness risked widening the divide. For Matilda, the injustice was clear. Her father had labored to secure her inheritance, binding his lords by solemn vow. To see those vows discarded at the moment of his death was a betrayal that could not be tolerated. Yet her path back to the throne would be long and fraught, for legitimacy demanded more than right. It demanded force of arms, alliances, and to command loyalty in a land increasingly weary of uncertainty. And so, the kingdom found itself sliding toward conflict, not with the roar of a single battle, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of a storm gathering on the horizon. Local lords fortified their castles, weighing which claimant to support. Families were divided, brothers and cousins choosing opposite sides. The church, though outwardly supportive of Stephen, remained uneasy, its leaders aware that Matilda's claim still carried the weight of Henry's memory. This was not only a dynastic quarrel, it was a test of whether oaths mattered, whether law could bind power, and whether a woman could stand. At the center of England's monarchy, the years that followed would prove merciless in their toll, not because of any single clash, but because the conflict refused to end. Neither Stephen nor Matilda could achieve a decisive victory. Battles would be fought, castles besieged, towns burned, and alliances shifted like sand. Chroniclers would later write of the land descending into chaos, of lords who acted as kings in their own domains, and of common people left to suffer under the weight of endless strife. They would give this time a single, stark name: the Anarchy. The choice of that word spoke volumes. It was not simply civil war, it was the collapse of order itself, the sense that the kingdom had lost its anchor. Where Henry had once imposed unity, now there was only division. Where the king's justice had once ruled, now private justice and feudal might prevailed. To live in England during those years was to inhabit a realm where loyalty was provisional, authority was contested, and the future was uncertain. And yet, within this turbulence, larger forces were at work. The Plantagenet line was rising in Anjou, preparing for a role that would eventually reshape not only England, but the very map of Europe. The church was evolving, balancing its role as arbiter of legitimacy against its need to survive amidst rival powers. And the people of England, though voiceless in chronicles, carried within their endurance the silent weight of history, sustaining the land until order could be restored. The story of Stephen and Matilda, then, was more than a quarrel between two individuals. It was the story of a nation tested by questions that would echo for centuries. What gives a monarch the right to rule? How far can ambition bend the bonds of oath and honor? And when order breaks, how long can a kingdom endure the storm before unity is found again? As this tale unfolds, you may find yourself drawn deeper into a world of castles and councils, betrayals and alliances, moments of triumph and near despair. It is a saga that shaped the destiny of England, a reminder that even in times of disorder, the seeds of renewal are sown. If you wish to follow this journey through every twist and turn, the battles, the escapes, the shifting tides of fortune, stay with the story. For what lies ahead is a drama unlike any other in medieval history. The anarchy had begun, and with it, nearly 2 decades in which England would hang in the balance between law and ambition, oath and betrayal, order and chaos. Thus the anarchy had begun, its first tremors shaking the realm as oaths and ambitions collided. Yet while Stephen settled into his throne at Westminster, believing ceremony and coronation had secured his rule, the true challenge was only gathering strength across the Channel. In Normandy, Matilda and her husband, Geoffrey Plantagenet, prepared to turn principle into action, setting in motion the campaign that would carry the struggle for England into its next and fiercer stage. While Stephen settled into his throne in Westminster, across the Channel in Normandy, a different story was taking shape. Empress Matilda, the daughter of Henry I and the rightful heir by oath, refused to accept the outcome of her cousin's daring seizure of power. With her stood her husband, Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, young, energetic, and ambitious in his own right. Together they began to forge a plan that would not only challenge Stephen's claim, but ignite a struggle that would define the fate of England for nearly 2 decades. From the castles of Anjou and the fertile valleys of Normandy, Matilda and Geoffrey marshaled their resources. Geoffrey, though often viewed with suspicion by the Norman lords, brought with him a formidable military tradition. His soldiers were disciplined, his leadership resolute, and his desire to extend his influence beyond Anjou matched Matilda's determination to claim her inheritance. Though their marriage had been marked by tension, in this cause their ambitions aligned perfectly. The throne of England, promised and sworn to Matilda, was now their joint endeavor. Yet the challenge was immense. Stephen had already worn the crown for months, consolidating his authority, distributing lands to allies, and securing the favor of the church. To overthrow him required not just a claim in blood, but a demonstration of strength. And so, from Normandy, the preparations began. Letters to sympathetic lords in England, emissaries dispatched to gather allies, and troops trained for the day when the Channel would be crossed in the opposite direction. The divisions within England itself offered opportunity. Among the barons, loyalty was a fragile thing. Some, bound by the oaths sworn to Henry, remained committed to Matilda, if only quietly. They remembered the solemn promises, the weight of royal command, and they resented Stephen's swift usurpation. Others, more pragmatic, clung to Stephen, valuing the stability of a crowned king over the uncertainties of a contested succession. Between these poles stretched a wide gray zone, nobles watching and waiting, prepared to shift allegiance should fortune change. This fracture in loyalty was mirrored across the shires and castles of the realm. Lords raised banners, some bearing the device of Stephen, others pledging themselves to Matilda. It was a kingdom split in two, not yet fully at war, but trembling on the edge of conflict. To the chroniclers, it appeared as though England herself had been divided, a realm with 2 hearts beating out of rhythm. One might imagine the scene as if gazing upon a map of the realm in those years. To the south and east, Stephen's influence was strongest, anchored by London and supported by the bishops who had crowned him. To the west and north, discontent simmered, with lords more inclined to honor their pledges to Matilda or to exploit the weakness of divided kingship for their own gain. Across the Channel, Normandy remained contested ground. half loyal to Matilda, half tempted by Stephen's authority as king. From these divided lands, the banners of two houses rose, Stephen's with its air of immediate power, Matilda's with the weight of principle and oath. Two standards fluttered in the wind, symbols of a kingdom that could not agree upon its sovereign. Geoffrey Plantagenet took the lead in Normandy, pressing Stephen's supporters with raids and sieges. Though his campaigns were at first modest, they served a vital purpose. They kept pressure on Stephen and demonstrated that Matilda's cause was not extinguished. Matilda herself, proud and unyielding, lent the authority of her name to the endeavor, rallying those who believed in the sanctity of her claim. Her correspondence reached across the realm, appealing to Baron's sense of honor, to Bishop's duty to truth, and to the memory of her father's wishes. Meanwhile, in England, the seeds of rebellion began to sprout. Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's half-brother and one of the most powerful magnates in the kingdom, prepared to raise his standard in her name. His support would prove decisive, for he commanded vast estates and commanded loyalty that stretched across the western shires. With Robert on her side, Matilda could transform from claimant in exile to true contender for the crown. Stephen, ever aware of these undercurrents, worked tirelessly to shore up his position. He granted favors to the nobles of London, secured the loyalty of the church with gifts and assurances, and sought to bind powerful lords through marriage alliances. But his crown, glittering though it was, rested uneasily. He could not erase the memory of Henry's commands, nor the whispered belief that Matilda remained the rightful heir. Every rumor of her preparations, every hint of her return weakened the certainty of his rule. The first sparks of war began in scattered skirmishes, castles changing hands, raids carried out along the frontiers of loyalist and rebel lands. None yet decisive, but each a sign that the peace Stephen hoped to maintain was slipping away. The kingdom was sliding toward open conflict, and once the floodgates opened, they would not easily be closed. To the people of England, who tilled the fields and tended their homes, the struggle seemed distant at first, but soon they would feel its weight. Lords demanding men and coin, rival armies passing through the countryside, the uncertainty of law when two sovereigns claimed the throne. For them, the choice of allegiance was less about oaths or bloodlines than about survival. Yet even in their hardship, they were witnesses to a story that would echo through the ages. The Anarchy. A kingdom divided, a monarchy contested, a people caught between two claimants. Matilda's return, though gradual and tentative, signaled that Stephen's reign would never be uncontested. Her presence in Normandy was a reminder that the question of legitimacy had not been resolved, only delayed. Her determination, her alliances, and the slow gathering of strength promised that sooner or later the banners would rise in earnest and England would become a battlefield. Thus, Act 2 of the story began. Matilda across the Channel, preparing to claim what was hers by right. Stephen in Westminster, wearing a crown that weighed heavier with each passing day, and England itself, a realm of divided loyalties, waiting for the moment when hesitation would give way to open war. The anarchy was no longer a distant possibility. It was becoming a lived reality. And so the realm drifted closer to open war, the uneasy balance of divided loyalties trembling with every rumor of Matilda's advance. Skirmishes and raids foreshadowed the greater conflict to come, each clash a reminder that the kingdom could no longer endure two rival claims. The storm, long gathering, was about to break, and when it did, it would fall upon the city of Lincoln, where crown and cause would be tested in battle. The winter sun of February 1141 rose cold and pale over the city of Lincoln. Its towers and spires stood against a gray sky, the air heavy with expectation. The city, caught between rival allegiances, had become the stage for one of the most decisive confrontations of the age. Here, beneath the shadow of its great cathedral, the banners of King Stephen fluttered defiantly, while beyond the walls the forces of Matilda gathered under the command of her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester. The kingdom, divided and uncertain, now braced for the clash that would determine its future. Stephen had marched north to confront rebels who had risen against his rule, determined to assert his kingship through strength. With him rode loyal nobles and a force confident in their sovereign. Yet outside the city, Robert of Gloucester had drawn together the supporters of Matilda, men who had sworn to her father Henry, and refused to accept the crown upon Stephen's head. The fields around Lincoln echoed with the stamping of horses, the clatter of arms, and the cries of men preparing for battle. The encounter unfolded with relentless momentum. Stephen's knights fought with the vigor of loyalty and pride, but the tide of numbers and strategy favored Robert's host. The barons who had long doubted Stephen's cause now seized the moment to strike. Surrounded and pressed on every side, Stephen resisted with remarkable courage. Chroniclers later wrote of him wielding his sword with the resolve of one who knew that a crown hung in the balance. Yet courage could not outweigh circumstance. Encircled, outmatched, and with his followers falling away, Stephen was forced at last to surrender. The capture of a king was no small matter. In an instant, the fragile edifice of Stephen's rule seemed to collapse. Taken as a prisoner, he was led away in chains, his crown no longer on his head, but in the hands of fate. For Matilda and her supporters, it was a triumph beyond expectation. The usurper who had seized her throne was now her captive. The road to power, long blocked by his presence, appeared suddenly open. Word of the victory spread swiftly across the realm. In abbeys and castles, men whispered that Stephen's reign was ended, that God himself had delivered judgment. Supporters of Matilda lifted their voices in celebration, and many who had hesitated now turned their thoughts to her cause. For the first time since her father's death, it seemed possible that Matilda might sit upon the throne of England. Escorted in triumph, she entered London as a sovereign in all but name. At Westminster, she was hailed not yet as queen, but as Domina Anglorum, the Lady of the English. The title was carefully chosen, reflecting both the reality of her claim and the caution of a realm still hesitant to accept a woman as monarch. Yet in that moment, as she walked the halls of Westminster, her cause appeared radiant with success. The daughter of Henry I, the woman who had endured exile and defiance, now stood within reach of her inheritance. But triumph, as history so often reveals, can be fleeting. Though Stephen was captured, the kingdom was not yet subdued. Many lords remained loyal to him, bound by kinship, interest, or simple mistrust of Matilda's stern manner. The church, too, was uneasy, uncertain whether to embrace her rule or to wait for events to unfold. And in London itself, where merchants and citizens valued stability above all, doubts began to grow. Matilda, imperious and uncompromising, demanded recognition of her right, but her severity won few friends among those whose support she needed most. The weeks that followed, Lincoln brought both promise and peril. With Stephen imprisoned in Bristol, Matilda commanded the appearance of unchallenged authority. Yet her triumph carried within it the seeds of reversal. Her claims pressed too forcefully, her demands too absolute. She alienated allies even as she gained ground. The delicate art of kingship, or queenship, required more than rightful claim and military victory. It required the skill to weave together the competing interests of nobles, clergy, and commons into a fragile but lasting harmony. And so the story of Lincoln, though it appeared to herald Matilda's ascension, became instead a turning point of another kind. The victory was undeniable, yet the outcome remained elusive. The capture of Stephen did not deliver the crown, but rather drew England deeper into uncertainty. For the realm, it was a lesson in the cruel irony of history, that triumph may conceal defeat, and that the path to power is rarely straight. Thus, the Battle of Lincoln stands as one of the great dramas of the Anarchy. It revealed the fragility of Stephen's kingship, the resilience of Matilda's claim, and the volatility of a kingdom divided against itself. It was a moment when the tide seemed to turn, when the banners of Matilda soared high, and her enemies lay vanquished. Yet destiny had not finished its work. Ahead lay new challenges, new betrayals, and new reversals that would remind all of England that in times of civil war, nothing is certain until the final crown is placed and held. The triumph at Lincoln had carried Matilda to Westminster, her banners high and her rival in chains. For a brief moment, it seemed the crown of England was hers at last, the long struggle of oaths and bloodlines resolved in her favor. Yet the fate of kingdoms is rarely sealed by a single battle. Even as she stood in the halls of power, currents of resistance stirred beneath the surface. London, the beating heart of commerce and politics, watched her closely. There, amid its merchants and guilds, the next test of her rule would rise. not on the battlefield, but in the streets. The triumph at Lincoln had carried Matilda into London with the promise of a crown. She had walked through the halls of Westminster as Lady of the English, her cousin Stephen languishing in captivity, her banners flying high. For a moment, it seemed that history itself had yielded to her claim that the crown of her father was at last within her grasp. Yet in the very heart of the capital, where power was both fragile and essential, her fortunes began to unravel. London was no ordinary city. Its merchants, guilds, and aldermen possessed influence equal to that of many barons, and their support was indispensable for any monarch. The city thrived on commerce, and what its leaders prized above all was stability. They wanted a ruler who would protect trade, ensure safety, and govern with fairness. Matilda's cause carried the weight of legitimacy, but her demeanor was stern, imperious, and distant. Where Stephen had been affable, quick to charm, and eager to bestow favors, Matilda demanded obedience and recognition as her due. To her, the crown was a matter of right, not negotiation. To the citizens of London, such severity seemed perilously close to arrogance. The tension grew steadily. At first, the aldermen welcomed her presence, hoping she would affirm the city's privileges. But Matilda, determined to establish the authority of a rightful monarch, pressed her demands firmly. She sought funds to sustain her household and armies, levies to support her rule, and submission to her commands. The people, already weary of the burdens of war, resisted. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into open discontent. The same bells that had tolled for her arrival soon rang with a different sound, a signal of unrest spreading through the streets. It was a summer day when the crisis reached its peak. From the steeples of London, church bells rang out in alarm. Crowds gathered, surging through narrow lanes, voices rising in anger. Market stalls stood abandoned as citizens poured into the streets, crying out against the woman who had entered their city, not as a queen of grace, but as a sovereign of demands. The clamor echoed through the walls of Westminster, reaching the ears of Matilda and her household. The chronicles described the uproar as sudden and overwhelming, a tide of voices and movement impossible to contain. Matilda's advisers warned her that the city could no longer be held. To stay was to risk violence, to see her triumph turned into disaster. And so, as night fell, she abandoned Westminster. Beneath the cover of darkness, her retinue slipped away, the torches of angry citizens flickering in the distance, the sound of bells still reverberating in the summer air. The woman who had entered London in triumph was now fleeing its streets in haste. For her enemies, it was a moment of vindication. They proclaimed that Matilda had shown her true nature, too proud, too unyielding, unfit to win the hearts of those she claimed to rule. For her supporters, it was a bitter reminder that legitimacy alone could not secure a throne. In the delicate web of medieval politics, victory required more than armies and oaths. It required the favor of the people who made the capital their home, the goodwill of merchants, and the loyalty of those who feared instability more than injustice. The uprising in London was more than a temporary setback. It revealed the deeper weakness of Matilda's position. Though she had captured Stephen and forced recognition of her right, she had failed to master the art of compromise. Her rule promised authority, but it did not inspire affection. In a society where allegiance was fluid, affection could be the difference between loyalty and rebellion. The loss of London was a political failure of the gravest kind. Without the capital, no monarch could claim secure possession of the English crown. The treasury, the markets, the symbolic weight of Westminster all slipped from her grasp in a single night of unrest. Her claim remained intact in law, but in practice it was gravely wounded. Those who had wavered now hesitated again, uncertain whether to cast their lot with a claimant who had fled the very city she hoped to rule. Stephen's captivity, which had seemed the end of his reign, now began to lose its power. His allies, emboldened by Matilda's misstep, rallied more strongly to his cause. The queen, his wife, worked tirelessly to gather support, reminding nobles that Stephen still lived and that the realm need not yield to a ruler who inspired fear more than loyalty. Slowly, the tide that had surged in Matilda's favor after Lincoln began to recede. For Matilda herself, the flight from London was a chastening experience. She had believed that justice and right would be enough, that her father's legacy and her cousin's defeat would carry her to the throne. But England was proving a harsher teacher. Authority required not only legitimacy, but also persuasion, generosity, and the ability to balance stern command with the softer arts of rule. Without those, even the greatest victories could dissolve into smoke. The episode left a lasting mark on the Anarchy. It underscored that the conflict was not merely about armies clashing on fields, but about politics, perception, and the fragile relationship between sovereign and subjects. In a kingdom weary of uncertainty, a ruler who could not win trust was bound to falter. The uprising in London was a reminder that crowns are not only claimed by right, they are also bestowed by acceptance. Thus, what had seemed within reach after Lincoln slipped away in the streets of London. The bells that had once heralded Matilda's triumph now tolled for her retreat. In their sound lay the truth of her struggle. She could command loyalty through law, but not devotion through love. And without both, the throne of England would remain contested. The anarchy deepened, and with it, the long, weary years of struggle stretched ahead. For England, the night Matilda fled London marked not only the fall of a claimant's hopes, but the confirmation that this war would not be decided quickly. It was a lesson etched into the heart of the realm that political failure could wound as deeply as military defeat, and that in civil war, fortune is as fleeting as the ringing of a bell. The night Matilda fled London marked the unraveling of her triumph. What victory at Lincoln had promised, the uprising in the capital had undone. In the wake of her retreat, uncertainty spread once more across the realm. And where doubt took root, opportunity soon followed. As Matilda's cause faltered, the allies of Stephen stirred, and at their heart stood a figure of quiet strength and unshaken resolve, his queen, Maud of Boulogne. The bells of London had tolled against Matilda, and in the aftermath of her retreat, the kingdom stirred with renewed uncertainty. For though she had triumphed at Lincoln and carried Stephen away in captivity, her inability to secure the capital had weakened her claim. In that moment of doubt, her adversaries seized their chance. Among them, none was more steadfast than Stephen's wife, Queen Maud of Boulogne. Maud was no passive consort, strong in will, shrewd in judgment, and unyielding in her loyalty to her husband. She became the rallying point for his cause. While Stephen languished in confinement, she summoned allies, appealed to the baron's sense of stability, and reminded the church that a crowned and anointed king still lived. Her presence alone gave Stephen's followers a focus, a queen who embodied resilience at a time when the king's cause seemed nearly lost. By her side stood powerful allies. Henry of Winchester, Stephen's brother and papal legate, lent the authority of the church. Loyal nobles, unsettled by Matilda's severity, drifted back into Stephen's orbit. Slowly, the balance began to shift. What had seemed impossible in the wake of Lincoln now took shape. A movement to restore Stephen to freedom and to the throne. The opportunity came through the fortunes of war. Just as Stephen had fallen into Matilda's hands at Lincoln, so too did her greatest champion, Robert of Gloucester, found himself a prisoner later that same year. In a skirmish near Winchester, Robert was captured, and the scales of the conflict tilted once more. Now each side held the other's most precious leader. The logic of negotiation, stronger than the cries of battle, compelled both camps to consider exchange. In a solemn arrangement, Stephen was released in return for Robert. The king, once paraded as a captive, walked free again, his crown tarnished but not lost. The effect was electric. Across the kingdom, his supporters rejoiced, for their king had been restored. The realm, which had seemed poised to acknowledge Matilda, was once again balanced on the knife edge of rivalry. Stephen returned to Westminster not in triumph, but in defiance. He had tasted defeat, endured captivity, and seen his crown slip away. Yet he emerged with renewed determination. To his followers, his survival itself was a sign of divine favor, proof that he was destined to rule despite adversity. To his enemies, his release was a reminder that the war was far from over. The civil struggle that had seemed on the verge of resolution now returned to stalemate. Neither claimant could achieve final victory. Matilda retained legitimacy and the loyalty of key barons, but her failure in London had scarred her cause. Stephen, though restored, bore the mark of a king whose crown had been contested and whose authority was fragile. The kingdom itself remained the true victim, its fields ravaged, its people burdened, its justice overshadowed by private war. And yet, in this return of Stephen, the nature of the anarchy revealed itself with clarity. This was not a war of single battles deciding a crown, but a war of endurance, where victory and defeat traded places with dizzying speed. Lincoln had given Matilda the upper hand. Winchester restored Stephen. Tomorrow might bring yet another reversal. It was a conflict that consumed decades, draining strength from all who fought and leaving the realm suspended between two monarchs. For now, the balance had been restored. Stephen once again wore his crown. Maud of Boulogne stood as his unwavering partner, and the kingdom braced for the next chapter of strife. The anarchy continued, not as a story of triumph and collapse, but as a long and grinding struggle in which the fortunes of war spared no one. The release of Stephen was more than the freedom of a king. It was the reawakening of a rivalry that would refuse to die until the realm itself forced resolution. The release of Stephen restored the balance of rivalry, but it did not restore peace. What had begun as a struggle between two claimants had now hardened into a war of attrition, dragging on with no victor in sight. And as kings and nobles traded victories in reversals, it was not only crowns that suffered. Beneath the shifting banners, the people of England bore the deepest wounds, their lives caught in a conflict that seemed endless. It was in their fields, their villages, and their churches that the true cost of the anarchy was revealed. The rivalry between Stephen and Matilda raged on, but while lords and bishops debated legitimacy and armies shifted from battle to negotiation, the people of England bore the heaviest burden. In chronicles penned by monks, witnesses who saw not only courts and castles, but the misery of fields and villages, a single lament resounded through the ages: Christ and his saints slept. It was their way of saying that the kingdom, once guided by law and faith, had fallen into a darkness where justice seemed absent and suffering unchecked. The land itself reflected the turmoil. Villages that had once hummed with the steady rhythm of plows and harvest now lay silent, their fields untended or scorched by passing forces. Lords, seizing the opportunity of a weakened crown, built castles without royal sanction. These fortresses, symbols of defiance as much as protection, rose across the countryside like iron teeth biting into the land. From their towers, minor barons ruled as petty kings, extracting what they could from those beneath them, caring little for allegiance to Stephen or Matilda, so long as their own dominion endured. For the common folk, life became a constant negotiation with fear. One day, a company of soldiers bearing Stephen's banner might march through their village, demanding provisions and loyalty. The next, men sworn to Matilda might arrive with equal insistence. To resist was perilous. To comply meant impoverishment. Families hid what little grain they had, buried valuables in the earth, and prayed that the storm of war would pass them by. Yet in many places, the storm lingered for years. The chronicles describe fields left untilled, churches stripped of offerings, and travelers avoiding the roads for fear of bandits who claimed to serve one cause or the other. The royal justice that Henry I had once imposed, firm, centralized, and feared, dissolved in the haze of civil strife. In its absence, private justice thrived. Disputes were settled by strength, and the weak had little recourse. What had once been a kingdom bound by law became a patchwork of fiefdoms, each answering only to the ambitions of its lord. The cry, "Christ and his saints slept," was not merely poetic despair. It captured the sense that the moral order itself had failed. Priests still said Mass. Bells still rang for worship, but the presence of the divine felt distant when violence and greed seemed to go unpunished. For a devout people whose daily lives were framed by the rhythms of the church, this absence of justice was as bitter as the physical hardships they endured. And yet, amid the suffering, life continued. Children were born, marriages celebrated, harvests gathered when possible. Human resilience, stubborn and quiet, carried the realm through its darkest hours. But every family, every village carried scars of uncertainty. The throne might belong to Stephen or to Matilda, but to the people it often seemed to belong to neither. Instead, it belonged to the strongest warlord who passed through, the one with the power to command obedience and the will to take what he pleased. This was the essence of the anarchy. Not only the clash of royal claimants, but the collapse of centralized authority. A kingdom divided at the top meant chaos at the bottom. The crown, once the symbol of unity, was no longer able to shield the realm from disintegration. England had become a land where the king's writ no longer ran, where castles multiplied like weeds, and where the lines of allegiance shifted with each season. The lords themselves, though often condemned in chronicles for their excesses, were caught in the same cycle of insecurity. With no strong king to bind them, they fortified their holdings, raised armies, and fought both to defend and to expand. Their ambition fueled the chaos, but it was also a response to the absence of order. In such a world, to stand idle was to risk ruin. Thus, even those who might have wished for peace were drawn into the cycle of conflict. For the people who tilled the land, however, the distinctions mattered little. Whether the banner above the castle wall bore the Lion of Anjou or the cross of Stephen, the burden was the same: to pay, to labor, and to endure. The great chronicles that speak of lords and battles also pause to describe the peasants who groaned under the weight of endless demands. In those lines, the true cost of the anarchy becomes visible, not in crowns won or lost, but in lives ground down by uncertainty. It is here that the story of the anarchy expands beyond the rivalry of two individuals to reveal its broader truth. Civil war corrodes not only the structures of power, but the fabric of everyday life. The people of England, who had little say in who wore the crown, nonetheless paid the price of every reversal of fortune. When Stephen was captured, they hoped for resolution. When Matilda was driven from London, they groaned at the return of strife. And when Stephen was restored, they braced for yet more years of uncertainty. For them, there was no triumph, only survival. And yet, even in these years of despair, the endurance of the people laid the groundwork for renewal. By carrying on in their villages, by preserving the rhythms of life as best they could, they sustained a realm that would one day emerge from chaos. The anarchy may have seemed a time when even the saints slept, but history would prove that the kingdom itself, though scarred, would awaken. Thus, the anarchy was not remembered only for its battles or its claimants, but for the long night it cast over the lives of ordinary men and women. It was a reminder that when kings falter and oaths are broken, it is the common people who suffer most. Their story, whispered in chronicles and carried in the lament of monks, remains the truest testament to those dark years. A kingdom divided, people burdened, in a sense that the world itself had fallen out of order. Thus, the chronicles spoke not only of kings and battles, but of villages left desolate, of peasants bowed beneath endless demands, of a kingdom where law itself had vanished. This was the truest face of the anarchy, a realm where survival replaced order and where crowns seemed powerless to shield the land. Yet even as the people endured, the struggle above them pressed on. Victory at one castle was undone at the next. Triumph turned to reversal, and the wheel of fortune spun without end. Out of this weary cycle unfolded the next chapter of the war. The years following Stephen's release from captivity revealed the very essence of the anarchy. A conflict without conclusion, a war where victories dissolved and defeats transformed into unexpected opportunities. It was a struggle that turned like a wheel, raising one claimant only to cast them down again, leaving England suspended in uncertainty. If the chronicles of the time seem repetitive, sieges, treaties, betrayals, it is because the very life of the kingdom was caught in a cycle of shifting fortunes, never breaking free until exhaustion itself imposed peace. Stephen's return in 1141 had brought a surge of energy to his cause. To his followers, his freedom was proof of divine favor, a sign that his kingship, though contested, was still sanctified. His queen, Maud of Boulogne, labored tirelessly to hold together the fragile coalition of nobles, bishops, and mercantile interests that sustained him. With London once more closed to Matilda, Stephen's presence gave heart to those who longed for stability. Yet stability was always an illusion, for the forces of Matilda remained potent, her claim unweakened by her retreat. Robert of Gloucester, restored in the exchange for Stephen, returned to his sister's side with undiminished resolve. He knew her cause required not only legitimacy, but persistence, and he supplied both. From his stronghold in the west, he rallied supporters, fortifying castles and drawing men to her banner. The war entered a new phase, one of attrition, where neither claimant could strike the decisive blow, and both endured the grinding wear of endless campaigns. The geography of the war mirrored the fractured nature of the realm. The southeast, with London at its heart, leaned toward Stephen, buoyed by his recognition and the support of wealthy merchants. The west, stretching into the lands of Gloucester and beyond, favored Matilda, tied by blood and honor to her cause. In between lay a patchwork of shifting loyalties, castles taken and retaken, towns compelled to swear fealty first to one, then to the other. Chroniclers record with weary repetition how oaths were sworn and broken, how allegiances shifted like the winds. The war was not fought by great armies clashing in open fields. Lincoln had been an exception, but by sieges and raids, by long months spent encircling stone fortresses, by the slow starvation of towns. The age of castles dictated the age of war. Each fortress that rose in defiance of royal authority became both shield and sword, a bastion for one claimant, a thorn in the side of the other. England became a land of strongholds, its landscape scarred by towers and walls erected in haste, manned by garrisons eager to seize from their neighbors. For the common people, this meant little respite. The burden of supply fell on them, whether in the form of grain seized, labor demanded, or coin exacted. The chronicle phrase, "They built castles and filled them with devils," captures the bitterness of peasants who saw these fortresses not as protection, but as instruments of oppression. Each shift in allegiance brought fresh demands. To the barons, the war was politics. To the people, it was survival. Amid the turbulence, Matilda's fortunes rose again in the West. In 1142, she held her court at Oxford, a symbolic gesture that presented her not merely as claimant, but as ruling sovereign. For a time, it seemed that her persistence might wear down Stephen's fragile coalition, yet fortune turned once more. In December of that year, Stephen besieged Oxford, trapping Matilda within the castle walls as winter closed in. Supplies dwindled, prospects darkened. Here, legend entwines with history. One chronicler records that in the depth of winter, clad in white against the snow, Matilda slipped silently from Oxford under cover of night, crossing the frozen river to escape her captors. Whether embellished or not, the tale captures her indomitable spirit. A woman who refused to yield, who escaped the tightening noose of defeat with daring equal to her cousin's ambition. She fled to safety, but the opportunity for decisive victory had slipped away. The wheel turned again. For Stephen, Oxford was a triumph that seemed to reassert his authority, but like so many victories in this war, it was incomplete. Matilda remained at large, her claim undiminished. The barons who supported her still held vast estates, and her presence continued to inspire defiance. Stephen could capture castles, but he could not capture allegiance. Each time he pressed his advantage, resistance re-emerged elsewhere. The kingdom seemed determined to remain divided. The years rolled on, and the war settled into weary stalemate. Neither side had the resources to crush the other. Campaigns ended not in resolution, but in exhaustion. Nobles began to think less in terms of royal allegiance and more in terms of local advantage. Castles were built not for king or empress, but for the lord who could command them, and the people suffered the consequences. The lament "Christ and his saints slept" continued to echo in the chronicles, a reminder that for the vast majority of the realm, the War of Kings meant little beyond hardship, yet the wheel continued to spin. In 1147, the death of Robert of Gloucester dealt a heavy blow to Matilda's cause. He had been her greatest supporter, the anchor of her campaigns, the shield against Stephen's advances. Without him, her position weakened. Her son Henry, still a youth, was not yet ready to take the mantle. Matilda herself, wearied by years of struggle, returned eventually to Normandy, leaving England's struggle unresolved but preparing the stage for the next generation. Stephen, for his part, remained king, but not in the sense Henry I had been king. His authority was limited, contested, dependent on bargains with the barons. He wore the crown, but it rested uneasily. His reign was not marked by the strong justice of his uncle, but by compromise and disorder. The anarchy had reshaped the monarchy itself, revealing the fragility of power when legitimacy was doubted and authority dispersed. And then, As the 1150s dawned, the figure of Henry, Matilda's son, later to be known as Henry II, emerged. Young, energetic, and ambitious, he inherited not only the claim of his mother, but the lands of his father, Normandy, Anjou, and eventually Aquitaine through marriage. His domain stretched wider than that of any English king before him. The barons, weary of endless strife, began to look toward him as a potential resolution. The wheel was turning yet again, this time toward an end to the long night. Looking back, the shifting fortunes of the anarchy revealed the deeper truth of civil war, that it rarely produces resolution through a single triumph or defeat, but through the slow wearing down of all sides. Matilda triumphed at Lincoln only to lose London. Stephen was captured, then restored. Castles rose and fell, allegiances changed, and through it all, the people endured, uncertain which banner would fly above their homes tomorrow. The war was not a tale of heroes and villains, but of human ambition colliding with the fragility of order. Stephen was brave, generous, but indecisive. Matilda was rightful, determined, but uncompromising. Each possessed qualities that might have made a great ruler, and flaws that doomed them to stalemate. The wheel of fortune spared neither. As the chroniclers concluded, the anarchy was a time when there was nothing but disturbance. It was not one battle or one event that defined it, but the endless alternation of gain and loss, advance and retreat. It was a war in which the true victor was neither Stephen nor Matilda, but the endurance of England itself, a land scarred, burdened, yet still waiting for renewal. The wheel of fortune had spun for over a decade, leaving England scarred and uncertain. Neither Stephen nor Matilda could claim lasting victory, and in the exhaustion of stalemate, the kingdom seemed to drift without anchor. Yet the anarchy was never contained within England alone. Every reversal on the battlefield reverberated in council halls, in bishoprics, and across the borders of Christendom. For as much as the war was fought with swords and sieges, it was also waged through sermons, treaties, and shifting alliances. To understand its full weight, one must look beyond the castles of England to the wider world of church in Europe, where legitimacy was debated as fiercely as any clash of arms. As the anarchy dragged into its second decade, it became increasingly clear that the struggle for England's crown could not be understood in isolation. The fate of Stephen and Matilda was bound to larger powers, the papacy in Rome, the bishops of England, and the neighboring realms of Normandy, Anjou, and Scotland. The war was a domestic crisis, but its echoes resounded across Christendom, shaping alliances, testing loyalties, and redefining the fragile balance between crown and church. From the beginning, the church had played a decisive role. It was the bishops who placed the crown upon Stephen's head in Westminster, despite the oaths sworn to Matilda. Their support lent him an aura of legitimacy that armies alone could not supply. Yet this was a double-edged blessing. The church, as arbiter of spiritual authority, could give but also withdraw its sanction. In every synod and council, the question of who was the rightful ruler hovered like a shadow, forcing bishops to balance conscience against necessity. Henry of Winchester, Stephen's own brother, stood at the center of this drama. As papal legate, he held immense influence, both ecclesiastical and political. At first, his hand had raised Stephen's claim, justifying it as the will of the realm and the safeguard of stability. But as the war dragged on, Henry wavered. When Matilda's fortunes soared after Lincoln, he briefly shifted allegiance, recognizing her as Lady of the English. His defection revealed the church's pivotal role. A king might rule with castles and knights, but without the blessing of bishops, his reign always remained vulnerable. When Stephen was restored, Henry returned to his side, but the episode left a lasting impression of the church as a power above kings, weighing and judging their right to rule. Rome, too, watched the conflict closely. The papacy, entangled in its own contests with emperors and princes, had no desire to see England collapse into disorder. Papal letters urged peace, called for justice, and reminded both Stephen and Matilda of their oaths to the church. Yet the popes were cautious. hesitant to commit themselves fully to either claimant, wary of binding themselves to a cause that might fail. This ambiguity gave the bishops of England wide latitude, allowing them to act as brokers of legitimacy, their decisions swayed as much by politics as by principle. Beyond the church, Europe's courts also cast their gaze upon England. Normandy, long entwined with the English crown since the conquest of 1066, was itself divided. Many Norman lords leaned toward Matilda, both because she resided there and because her marriage to Geoffrey Plantagenet tied her to the rising power of Anjou. Yet others hesitated, calculating that Stephen's recognition as King of England made him a more stable ally. Normandy became a frontier of intrigue, where allegiances were bought, sold, and betrayed. Anjou, meanwhile, emerged as a decisive factor. Geoffrey Plantagenet, often overlooked in English chronicles that focus on Matilda, was quietly laying the foundation for the Plantagenet dynasty. Through campaigns in Normandy, he asserted control, building a domain that would one day pass to his son Henry. His ambition extended beyond his own lands. He understood that the struggle in England was not merely his wife's inheritance, but the key to uniting vast territories into a single empire. In his vision, Normandy, Anjou, and England were not separate realms, but parts of a greater whole. The anarchy in this light became less an isolated civil war and more the prelude to a continental transformation. To the north, Scotland played its own part. King David I, Matilda's uncle, saw in her cause both familial duty and political opportunity. Early in the conflict, he invaded northern England, seizing towns and fortresses under the pretext of supporting his niece's claim. For a time, Scottish banners flew deep into Northumbria, yet his involvement was never wholly selfless. He sought to expand Scottish influence while England was distracted. Though ultimately checked, his campaigns underscored how England's weakness invited encroachment from its neighbors. The anarchy was not only a domestic struggle, but a moment when the borders themselves grew uncertain. Through all these shifting alliances, the role of the church remained constant as mediator, judge, and sometimes opportunist. Bishops moved cautiously, careful not to tie themselves too tightly to a ruler who might fall. They counseled truce when exhaustion demanded it, pressed for peace when war grew unbearable, and reminded both sides that oaths before God were not to be taken lightly. Yet their actions were also political. Some bishops sought advantage, using the turmoil to expand their own power, while others sincerely longed for order and justice. For the people of England, these higher maneuvers mattered in ways both visible and unseen. Papal letters filtered down into sermons, shaping how priests spoke of the rival claimants. Scottish raids brought terror to border villages. Norman lords across the Channel shifted the balance of armies that might cross into England, and in every town the bishop's alignment, whether with Stephen or Matilda, colored local loyalties, lending moral weight to banners raised in civil strife. What emerges from this tapestry is the realization that the anarchy was never confined to England alone. It was part of the broader story of 12th century Europe, where dynasties intermarried, realms overlapped, and the papacy loomed as arbiter of kingship. The war revealed how fragile legitimacy could be when churchmen doubted, how porous borders became when a crown was contested, and how quickly opportunity tempted neighbors to press their claims. In the end, the anarchy demonstrated the limits of both crown and church. Stephen wore the crown but could not impose order. Matilda possessed legitimacy but could not win acceptance. The bishops blessed one then the other but could not bring peace. Rome issued commands, but England's lords obeyed only when it suited them. Scotland invaded, Normandy and Anjou maneuvered, yet no foreign power could decide the issue. Only exhaustion within England itself and the rise of Henry Plantagenet would bring resolution. Thus, the anarchy stands not only as an English civil war, but as a European episode woven into the politics of Christendom. Its struggles with legitimacy reflected broader tensions between church and state. Its shifting alliances mirrored the fragile patchwork of medieval Europe, where every crown was vulnerable to both domestic rebellion and foreign intrigue. And its outcome prepared the stage for a dynasty whose dominion would stretch from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees. The bells of Westminster, the banners of Normandy, the letters of Rome, the raids from Scotland, all were threads in the same tapestry. Together, they reveal that the anarchy was never a mere quarrel of cousins, but a contest that echoed across Europe, testing the meaning of kingship, the reach of the church, and the endurance of a people. So the anarchy resounded far beyond England's shores, through papal letters, Norman councils, Angevin campaigns, and Scottish raids, until even Christendom seemed to tire of a crown that could not choose its head. Yet history rarely yields to edicts or embassies. In the end, resolution would not come from Rome's parchments or Europe's wary courts, but from a new will rising within the quarrel itself. As the church weighed legitimacy and neighbors measured advantage, another force gathered across the channel, a young prince tempered by exile, armed with inheritance, and unafraid to seize the future. His name was Henry Plantagenet, and with his coming, the long night began to show a line of dawn. The long night of the anarchy had stretched over England for nearly 2 decades, and by the late 1140-50s and early 1150-50s, the kingdom seemed weary beyond endurance. Lords had fortified their castles, peasants had grown accustomed to uncertainty, and bishops had shifted allegiance until the very meaning of loyalty felt blurred. Stephen remained king, but a king constrained, dependent on bargains with the great barons, and unable to impose the unity once embodied by his uncle Henry I. Matilda, once so close to victory, had withdrawn to Normandy, her energies spent, her cause entrusted to another. It was in this moment that a new figure stepped onto the stage, bold, restless, and destined to reshape not only England but the very map of Europe. Henry Plantagenet. Henry was the son of Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou, a child of 2 powerful lineages, heir not only to his mother's disputed crown, but also to his father's ambitious domains across the Channel. Born in 1133, he grew up in the shadow of the anarchy, his earliest years marked by the chaos that engulfed his mother's homeland. But in Normandy and Anjou, he inherited something more stable, a growing power base carefully cultivated by Geoffrey, who had seized control of Normandy through persistence and force of arms. By the time Henry reached manhood, he commanded respect not only as Matilda's son, but as lord of territories that gave him wealth, men, and ambition on a scale unmatched by Stephen's heirs. Cinematically, one might imagine him in contrast to the figures who had dominated the earlier struggle. Stephen, though brave and generous, was weighed down by years of compromise and defeat. Matilda, proud and unyielding, had become a symbol of justice denied, but also of opportunities missed. Into this weary landscape strode Henry, young and audacious, with the vigor of a new generation and the clarity of one who had not yet tasted the full bitterness of civil war. Where others hesitated, he acted. Where others bargained, he challenged. Henry's first ventures into England were daring, even reckless. In 1147, still a youth of only 14, he crossed the Channel with a small force, more an expedition of audacity than of conquest. His resources were meager, his following limited, and yet he flung himself onto English soil with the boldness of one who believed destiny was on his side. Chroniclers, half in admiration and half in disbelief, recorded the event as a sign of the fiery temperament that would define his reign. Though the expedition achieved little in military terms, his troops soon dispersed, and he returned across the sea. It marked the arrival of a new contender, one whose youth was no weakness, but a signal of future strength. In the years that followed, Henry's stature grew. His father Geoffrey continued to consolidate Normandy, and upon Geoffrey's death in 1151, Henry inherited both Anjou and Normandy, becoming one of the most powerful princes in France. His ambitions expanded further with his marriage in 1152 to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most sought-after heiress in Europe, whose vast duchy stretched across southwestern France. In a single stroke, Henry united lands that gave him more wealth and manpower than any English king had ever possessed. It was as though fortune itself had been waiting for him, withholding victory from Matilda so that her son might inherit not only her claim, but a continental empire. By the early 1150s, Stephen's reign appeared exhausted. His authority had never been secure, and his hopes of dynastic continuity rested on his son Eustace. Yet even among the barons, enthusiasm for Stephen's line waned. The endless conflict had drained resources, eroded loyalties, and left many lords longing for stability. Henry's arrival on the political stage offered an alternative, a ruler young enough to inspire, strong enough to command, and wealthy enough to impose order. Cinematically, one might picture the moment of Henry's landing in England in 1153, no longer the boy of 1147, but a prince in the fullness of early manhood, banners flying, retainers at his side, his eyes fixed on the prize his mother had pursued but never gained. The land he entered was scarred by years of strife, its castles bristling like thorns, its people weary of war. To them, Henry represented not only another claimant, but the possibility of renewal. Stephen, for all his resilience, was by then an older man, his strength worn by the burdens of ceaseless conflict. When he met Henry in battle, it was not with the vigor of youth, but with the stubbornness of one who refused to yield. Yet even he must have sensed that the wheel of fortune had turned. His victories no longer inspired confidence, his defeats no longer shocked. The realm itself seemed ready to embrace change, to entrust its future to the young Plantagenet. What made Henry's rise so striking was not only his inheritance of lands and armies, but his command of vision. He saw the anarchy not as endless stalemate, but as an opportunity to build something greater than either Stephen or Matilda had imagined. His realm would not be confined to England. It would stretch across the Channel, uniting Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and beyond. His was a generation that thought not only of survival, but of empire. The anarchy had revealed the fragility of kingship. Henry would make it strong again, not by compromise, but by scale, by building a dominion so vast that its very magnitude imposed respect. For the barons of England, Henry's emergence forced a choice. Some clung to Stephen, bound by ties of loyalty or habit. Others turned to Henry, persuaded by his promise of order and dazzled by his continental power. Yet for many, the decision was less about loyalty than about pragmatism. After years of shifting allegiances, what mattered most was stability. And Henry, with his youth, his vigor, and his vast resources, seemed to embody that promise. It is tempting to see Henry's rise as inevitable, the natural culmination of years of struggle. Yet history rarely moves so smoothly. His first expedition had ended in failure. His inheritance was contested. His marriage to Eleanor scandalized many, and his youth made him a target of skepticism. But what set Henry apart was his persistence. Like his mother before him, he refused to yield to misfortune. Unlike her, he possessed the charisma to inspire, the fortune to inherit vast lands, and the boldness to act decisively. The arrival of Henry Plantagenet marked the beginning of the end for the anarchy. Though the conflict would not resolve immediately, his presence transformed the contest. Stephen was no longer merely opposed by Matilda, a claimant who had struggled for acceptance. He was challenged by a new generation, a man who embodied both legitimacy and power, who offered not just continuity, but renewal. The people of England, weary of castles and warlords, looked upon him as a figure of hope. And so, as Henry strode upon English soil, the drama of the anarchy entered its final act. The stage was set for confrontation, negotiation, and at last resolution. The young Plantagenet, fiery and ambitious, stood against the aging Stephen, stubborn and diminished. The wheel of fortune, which had spun so long in circles of stalemate, seemed at last ready to carry England into a new age. The story of Henry's rise is not merely the tale of one man's ambition. It is the story of a generation's longing for peace, of a kingdom yearning for unity after years of division. It is the moment when the tragedy of Matilda's struggle gave way to the promise of her son's triumph. In him, the cause of legitimacy found new life, and the hope of order re-emerged from the long night of anarchy. Thus, the young Henry Plantagenet became not only a claimant to the English crown, but the harbinger of a new dynasty, the architect of what would become the Angevin Empire, and the figure through whom the anarchy would at last find its resolution. Thus, Henry's arrival on English soil did not simply mark the entrance of a new claimant. It signaled the dawn of resolution after a generation of turmoil. Where Stephen had grown weary and Matilda withdrawn, Henry brought the vigor of youth and the promise of unity. Yet even he could not win by arms alone. The kingdom, scarred and exhausted, no longer had strength for another decade of siege and betrayal. What England yearned for was not another battle, but an end. And so, as the summer of 1153 unfolded, the stage shifted from the clash of swords to the quiet power of negotiation, where Stephen and Henry would finally face one another, not as conqueror and conquered, but as men compelled by necessity to forge peace. The year was 1153, and England, scarred by nearly 2 decades of division, seemed poised on the edge of final resolution. The endless wheel of fortune had turned again and again, lifting Stephen, then Matilda, only to cast each down in turn. Yet now a new figure, Henry Plantagenet, had entered the realm, not as a reckless youth, but as a prince of formidable power. His campaigns in that year did not bring a sweeping military triumph, but they achieved something more decisive: the exhaustion of all parties, the recognition that no further victory could secure peace, and the realization that compromise was the only path left. The kingdom itself seemed to demand an end. The land was weary of warlords and sieges, weary of castles rising and falling, weary of oaths sworn and broken. The people who had borne the brunt of the anarchy longed for stability above all else. Nobles who had once reveled in the freedom of divided rule began to crave the certainty of a strong crown. Even the bishops, long cautious in their allegiance, pressed for settlement. In this climate of exhaustion, Stephen and Henry found themselves drawn toward one another, not as conqueror and vanquished, but as weary adversaries seeking a way to preserve dignity and secure the future. Cinematically, one can imagine the meeting at Wallingford, a tent pitched between the lines, summer air heavy with the stillness of truce. Stephen, gray-haired and burdened, the years of struggle etched upon his face, sat across from Henry, vigorous and determined, his eyes alight with the confidence of youth. Between them lay not only a table, but the memory of 20 years of turmoil, the weight of lives lost, the hopes of a kingdom waiting for resolution. Silence must have hung for a moment before words were spoken, each man measuring the other, aware that history itself had brought them to this point. Stephen, for all his resilience, understood that his reign could not endure beyond his lifetime if left to his son Eustace. The young prince had fought for his inheritance, but his ambition clashed with the tide of opinion. Many barons refused to accept him, unwilling to continue the war for a dynasty they did not trust. Moreover, Eustace's sudden death in the summer of 1153, under circumstances remembered with sorrow and mystery, left Stephen's house bereft of clear succession. Without an heir strong enough to command loyalty, Stephen's position weakened irreparably. The king must have felt both grief and grim clarity. His path forward now lay not in defiance, but in concession. Henry, on the other hand, carried the strength of promise. He was young, commanding, and already master of lands far greater than those of any English king. Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, all were his, and England could not remain apart from such dominion forever. Yet he too understood that outright conquest was not the path. The kingdom, weary and fragile, could not endure further bloodshed. His claim would be strongest not by destroying Stephen, but by joining with him, allowing the crown to pass with dignity rather than by force. The negotiations that followed were tense but pragmatic. Stephen demanded respect for his kingship until death. Henry, in turn, demanded recognition as heir, his rights secured not by conquest, but by agreement. Each sought not only to protect his own honor, but to assure the stability of the realm. Behind them, bishops and barons urged reconciliation, eager to bind wounds that had festered too long. The treaty that emerged, sealed at Wallingford, offered what the war itself never had, a compromise that satisfied both sides without humiliating either. By its terms, Stephen would remain king until his death, his dignity preserved, his authority recognized. Henry would be acknowledged as his successor, the crown passing to him in due course. The agreement did not erase the years of war, nor did it heal every scar, but it provided an honorable exit for a conflict that had long since lost its purpose. The image of Stephen and Henry seated across from one another, hands extended in accord, resonates as one of the most poignant moments of the age. It was not the drama, of Hastings, nor the thunder of Lincoln, nor the desperate escape from Oxford. It was quieter, more deliberate, but no less decisive. In that act of compromise, the anarchy came to its close. For Stephen, the treaty was a final act of statesmanship. He had fought bravely, endured captivity, rebuilt his crown, and resisted every challenge. But he recognized at last that his reign must end with peace, not further conflict. By choosing Henry, he ensured that his kingdom would not descend into endless war. For Henry, the treaty was the fulfillment of his mother's claim, achieved not by her hand, but by his. The throne that had eluded Matilda now came to her son, not through bloodshed, but through recognition. The Treaty of Wallingford, sometimes called the Treaty of Winchester, thus stands as a moment of reconciliation in an age of division. It was a settlement that allowed the kingdom to breathe again, that gave its people hope for stability, and that paved the way for the rise of the Plantagenet dynasty. It was, as contemporaries understood, a peace not born of victory, but of necessity, an honorable exit for a war that had tested the patience of God and men alike. Cinematically, one might close the scene with the two figures departing the tent. Stephen returning to his household, aged but unbroken, aware that his final duty was to keep faith with the treaty. Henry riding forth, youthful and unyielding, carrying with him the promise of renewal. The realm, though still scarred, could at last glimpse an end to its long ordeal. The significance of the treaty extended far beyond the personalities of Stephen and Henry. It reasserted the principle that legitimacy could be restored through agreement as well as conquest, that even in an age of violence, compromise remained possible. It affirmed the role of the church as mediator, its bishops guiding the realm toward peace, and it marked the transition from the chaos of disputed succession to the stability of a dynasty that would dominate the next century. For the people of England, the treaty was more than politics. It was the end of uncertainty. No longer would their lives be dictated by the rise and fall of rival banners, by the endless toll of castles and campaigns. At Wallingford, a weary kingdom laid down its arms, not in defeat, but in relief. Thus the anarchy, that long night of turmoil when Christ and his saints slept, gave way at last to the promise of morning. The Treaty of Wallingford did not erase the past, but it allowed England to step into a future where the crown would be secure, the realm united, and the legacy of Matilda preserved through her son. And in that solemn accord between a tired king and an ambitious prince, history found its resolution. The Treaty of Wallingford had stilled the clash of arms, but it could not still the passage of time. The ink on parchment brought a fragile peace, yet all who witnessed it knew that the true resolution would come not through words, but through the inevitable course of mortality. Stephen remained king, his dignity preserved, while Henry stood waiting in the wings, the promise of renewal embodied in his youth. England held its breath, caught between an old ruler who had endured much and a young heir whose destiny was yet to unfold. And so, as months turned into years, the kingdom moved quietly toward the moment when one life would end and another would ascend, sealing the transition that compromise had only prepared. The treaty at Wallingford had stilled the storms, but the resolution of the anarchy came not in the signing of parchment, but in the passing of one life and the ascent of another. In October 1154, Stephen, weary from years of struggle and burdened by age, breathed his last at Dover. He had reigned for nearly 2 decades, years marked not by triumph, but by turmoil, not by conquest, but by compromise. Yet in death, he left behind not the chaos that had haunted his reign, but the fragile peace he had forged in its final years. For Stephen, the end was dignified. He had secured through the treaty that his kingdom would not fracture further upon his passing. He had kept his word, honoring the agreement with Henry, and by doing so, he had spared England another descent into bloodshed. He was not remembered as a conqueror, nor as a lawgiver, but as a man who had endured, who had fought with resilience, and who, in the twilight of his reign, had chosen peace over pride. His burial at Faversham Abbey closed the chapter of his contested crown, a reminder of a king whose reign was defined not by absolute power, but by the struggle to preserve dignity amid discord. Henry, scarcely 21 years old, now crossed the Channel to claim the inheritance that had eluded his mother. His arrival in England was no longer the reckless gamble of a boy, but the triumphant entry of a sovereign whose legitimacy was uncontested. In December 1154 at Westminster, he was crowned Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet kings. The crown that had slipped from Matilda's grasp now rested firmly on her son's brow, and with it began one of the most powerful dynasties in European history. Cinematically, one can imagine the coronation as a deliberate contrast to the long years of chaos. Where once oaths had been broken, now they were renewed. Where once bishops hesitated, now they anointed with confidence. Where once banners of rival lords had clashed, now they hung together in solemn ceremony. The realm, though scarred by war, felt the weight of continuity restored. In the great church of Westminster, beneath the vaulted ceilings and the chanting of clerics, Henry was crowned not only as King of England, but as the embodiment of renewal. Henry II's accession marked more than a change of ruler. It marked the birth of a new political order. With his vast continental dominions, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, he stood as more than an English monarch. He was lord of an empire stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. His resources, his energy, and his vision promised to restore strength to the English crown, to replace the feeble compromises of Stephen's reign with the firm justice once associated with Henry I. The Plantagenet age had begun, an age that would see England's monarchy not as a fragile prize of rival claimants, but as a central power in European affairs. Yet the memory of the anarchy lingered. The chronicles remembered those 2 decades as a time when Christ and his saints slept, when castles multiplied, when justice faltered, when loyalty dissolved. That memory shaped Henry's reign. Determined never to let the crown fall again into dispute, he reasserted royal authority with vigor. Castles built without license were torn down, barons reminded of their subordination, law reimposed. The lessons of the anarchy became the foundations of reform. Out of chaos, order was rebuilt. For the people of England, the accession of Henry II was not merely the triumph of one dynasty over another, it was the end of uncertainty. After years in which their lives were tossed between Stephen and Matilda, they could now look to a single sovereign, young and strong, with the promise of continuity. The scars of war remained, but the rhythm of fields and markets, of churches and towns, began once more to settle into stability. Stephen's death and Henry's coronation thus stand together as the turning of an age. One era closed, marked by stalemate, betrayal, and exhaustion. Another opened, full of energy, expansion, and ambition. The anarchy had been a tragedy for its time, but it prepared the way for the consolidation of royal power and the rise of a dynasty that would dominate England and much of France for a century to come. Cinematically, the closing image of the anarchy might be imagined as 2 intertwined scenes. In one, Stephen's body lowered into the abbey vault, the candles flickering, the mourners solemn, the air heavy with the end of a long, weary struggle. In the other, Henry II crowned at Westminster, the young king lifting his head beneath the golden circlet, the chants of the clergy echoing through the halls, the kingdom looking forward at last. Past and future bound together, one life ending, another beginning, the crown passing as if at last by the will of Providence rather than the accidents of war. The anarchy had tested England, strained its people, and reshaped its monarchy. But from that crucible emerged renewal. From disorder came stability, from defeat came endurance, and from the frustrated claim of a mother came the triumphant reign of her son. The story of Stephen and Matilda closed with Henry's coronation, and with it, the beginning of a dynasty that would carry England into one of its most formidable ages. Thus ended the anarchy, not with a decisive battle, not with the humiliation of one and the triumph of the other, but with the weary acceptance of peace, the death of a king, and the rise of another. From chaos, order had been born anew. The coronation of Henry II closed the long night of the anarchy, yet its shadows lingered. The scars left upon the realm, castles razed without leave, loyalties fractured, justice undone, did not vanish with a single crown placed upon a young king's head. To understand the true weight of those years, one must look beyond the clash of rivals and see what the conflict revealed about kingship itself, about the fragility of authority, and about the lessons that would shape the plantagenet age. The anarchy, remembered by chroniclers with the lament that Christ and his saints slept, was far more than a quarrel between two rival claimants. It was not merely a contest of banners, nor simply the tale of Stephen against Matilda, but a profound revelation of how fragile kingship could be, how essential legitimacy was to the medieval order, and how limited even the mightiest nobles remained within the framework of feudal society. At its core, the struggle was about more than the crown itself. It was about the meaning of authority. Henry I had secured his throne through strength and law, binding his realm under the certainty of his justice. But when he died without a male heir, that certainty unraveled. Matilda, his chosen successor, embodied the principle of dynastic legitimacy. Stephen, swift and pragmatic, embodied the reality of political will. Their conflict exposed the gap between theory and practice, between the sanctity of an oath and the shifting interests of barons and bishops. The anarchy revealed that legitimacy alone was insufficient. Matilda, though rightful heir, could not win acceptance from a realm unready for a female sovereign and unsettled by her uncompromising will. Stephen, though crowned and anointed, could not maintain stability when his authority was doubted and his decisions weakened by constant negotiation. Each in turn showed that kingship required not only claim or coronation, but the capacity to govern with firmness, wisdom, and acceptance. The war also underscored the dangers of feudal fragmentation. With royal authority weakened, barons seized their chance to build castles, levy their own forces, and rule as petty kings. England, once unified under the stern hand of Henry I, fractured into a mosaic of rivalries. The people suffered not only from shifting loyalties, but from the absence of consistent justice. In this sense, the anarchy revealed the limits of feudalism itself, a system that could protect the strong, but left the weak exposed when the crown faltered. And yet, within this turmoil, the seeds of renewal were planted. Out of chaos came the recognition that the monarchy must be stronger, more centralized, more firmly rooted in law. Henry II, shaped by the memory of disorder, would rebuild royal authority with vigor, ensuring that castles could not rise unchecked, that barons could not act without restraint, that the king's justice would reach every corner of the land. The lessons of the anarchy became the foundations of reform, turning tragedy into preparation. Thus, the nature of the anarchy lies not only in its battles or sieges, but in its meaning. It was a crucible in which the English crown was tested and reshaped, a reminder that power without legitimacy falters, and legitimacy without power fails. From its hardships emerged a monarchy stronger and more enduring, and from its divisions arose a dynasty whose rule would define an age. Thus, in its essence, the anarchy was not merely a tale of crowns contested, but of kingship itself tested and reshaped. Yet its meaning did not end with Stephen's death or Henry's accession. The lessons learned in those turbulent years cast a shadow far into the future, shaping how monarchy would be understood, how authority would be exercised, and how legitimacy would be secured. To grasp its true impact, one must turn from the nature of the conflict to the enduring consequences it left behind. The long shadow of the anarchy stretched far beyond the lives of Stephen and Matilda. Though its immediate outcome was the peaceful transfer of the crown to Henry II, its deeper consequence was the transformation of kingship itself. The chaos of 2 decades had stripped away illusions, revealing that monarchy could not rest solely on lineage or coronation. It required the convergence of legitimacy, noble support, ecclesiastical blessing, and the acceptance, however silent, of the people. In this sense, the anarchy became the crucible from which the Plantagenet dynasty was forged. Henry II inherited not only a kingdom, but also the hard lessons of his mother's struggle and his predecessor's failures. He understood that dynastic right must be married to practical authority, that oaths and rituals were nothing without the ability to enforce justice and inspire loyalty. His reforms, the curbing of baronial castles, the strengthening of royal courts, the expansion of administrative order were born from the memory of what happened when kingship faltered. The anarchy also clarified the indispensable role of the nobility. Barons had proved that no monarch, however legitimate, could govern without their cooperation. They could elevate a claimant, as they did with Stephen, or withhold allegiance, as they did with Matilda. Their castles, their private armies, their shifting loyalties dictated the course of the war. Yet in the end, the disorder they unleashed also convinced them of the need for stability. Their acceptance of Henry Plantagenet was less the triumph of his claim than the recognition that endless division threatened their own fortunes. Equally, the war underscored the power of the Church. From Stephen's hurried coronation at Westminster to Henry of Winchester's shifting allegiance, bishops had stood as arbiters of legitimacy. Their approval gave weight to crowns, their withdrawal undermined them. The papacy, though cautious, had loomed in the background, reminding rulers that their authority carried divine sanction only so long as it aligned with ecclesiastical conscience. In the Plantagenet age, this lesson would echo in the delicate balance between king and church, sometimes harmonious, often contentious, but always central. And though less often acknowledged, the people themselves were part of this equation. Chroniclers, in recording the despair of villages and towns, gave voice to the reality that a kingdom's strength rested not only in castles and courts, but in the endurance of its subjects. The lament that Christ and his saints slept revealed how deeply the suffering of the many could define the memory of an age. For Henry II and his successors, the lesson was clear. Royal power must ensure not only the dominance of the crown, but also the stability of the realm in which common lives might flourish. Thus, the long-term consequence of the anarchy was paradoxical. Out of disunity emerged unity. Out of contested succession came a dynasty that would dominate for centuries. Out of weakness grew the resolve to strengthen monarchy itself. Stephen's reign, marked by turmoil, became the warning. Henry II's reign, shaped by reform, became the response. Together, they ensured that never again would England so easily slip into the abyss of civil war over disputed inheritance. In the end, the anarchy left behind more than scars. It left a legacy, a recognition that kingship was not a solitary claim, but a shared structure dependent on the consent of lords, the blessing of the church, and the endurance of the people. It was this legacy that the Plantagenets inherited, and it was upon this foundation that they built one of the most formidable dynasties of the medieval world. Yet the anarchy's significance cannot be measured only in the immediate reforms of Henry II or in the lessons absorbed by the Plantagenets. Its shadow reached further, shaping not just policy but memory, not just governance but identity. What had begun as a bitter quarrel between cousins became, in retrospect, a defining chapter in the story of England, one whose legacy resonated through law, monarchy, and culture alike. It is here, in its enduring place within history, that the true weight of the anarchy can be seen. The anarchy occupies a unique place in the long story of England. To the chroniclers who lived through it, it was a time of sorrow, when law gave way to force and the kingdom seemed adrift. To later generations, it was remembered as a cautionary tale of disputed succession, of the chaos that followed when oaths were broken and authority fractured. Yet, in the broader arc of history, its legacy was paradoxical. Out of darkness came renewal, and from the ashes of division rose the foundations of a stronger crown. Henry II, who emerged from the turmoil as the first Plantagenet king, carried into his reign the hard lessons of his mother's struggle and Stephen's weary compromises. The memory of castles, sprouting unchecked across the countryside, of barons ruling like petty kings, of justice silenced by uncertainty, shaped his determination to restore royal power. He dismantled unauthorized fortresses, expanded royal courts, and established systems of law and administration that would endure for centuries. What the anarchy had torn apart, Henry sought to bind together with institutions rather than mere force. In this sense, the chaos of the Civil War became the seedbed of reform. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's queen, added a further dimension to this renewal. One of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages, she brought with her the vast Duchy of Aquitaine and a cultural legacy that infused the Plantagenet court with ideas of chivalry, literature, and governance. Together, Henry and Eleanor embodied a new age, an age in which the monarchy was not only stronger but broader in scope, connecting England with continental Europe in ways that reshaped politics, culture, and law. The marriage that followed the anarchy symbolized not division, but union, an alliance of lands and legacies that would define an empire. The anarchy also left a deeper imprint on the very idea of kingship. It demonstrated that no ruler could govern by divine right alone. Legitimacy required recognition from nobles, from the church, and, implicitly, from the people whose lives gave substance to the realm. The failure of Matilda to secure the crown despite her rightful claim showed that law and custom were not enough without acceptance. The struggles of Stephen revealed that coronation and title meant little without authority to enforce them. Henry II's reign, by contrast, illustrated the synthesis. Legitimacy, power, and governance combined to create a monarchy more durable than either claimant of the anarchy had achieved. Cinematically, the story closes with a poignant contrast. One can imagine the ruins of castles built in haste during the anarchy, their stones weathered, their towers crumbling, symbols of a time when the kingdom was fractured and uncertain. Slowly, the scene shifts. The shadowed ruins fade into the vision of a new court at Westminster, Henry and Eleanor presiding over a dynasty that would stretch across centuries. The noise of conflict subsides, replaced by the hum of administration, the murmur of legal proceedings, the steady rhythm of a kingdom once more at peace. From disorder, order has returned. From rivalry, unity has been born. In this way, the anarchy stands as more than a tragic interlude. It is a turning point, a dark valley that led to higher ground. The very fragility it exposed compelled later monarchs to strengthen what had been weak, to guard against the mistakes that had plunged the realm into chaos. And though remembered as a time when saints slept, its legacy ensured that the crown would awaken with renewed power, guiding England into the age of the Plantagenets. Thus, the story of the anarchy ends not with despair, but with transformation. Stephen and Matilda passed into history, their contest unresolved in life, but settled in legacy. Henry II rose, Eleanor stood beside him, and together they laid the groundwork for one of the most powerful dynasties of medieval Europe. The anarchy, with all its hardship, had been the crucible. The Plantagenet reign was the flame that emerged, carrying England forward into a new era.